So I'll go ahead and get us started because I've got a few welcoming and preamble comments, and so I'll get those going as everyone is getting ready to take their seats. And also, I can kill the music. There we go. So hi everyone, my name is Nicole Bell. I'm the Executive Director of the Cambia Grove, the place that you're at. And as we kick off tonight, just would love to have a show of hands in the audience. Who's been here before to the Grove? A fair amount of you. Okay, so for those of you who don't know us well yet, I hope you'll get to know us soon. What we are is a healthcare innovation hub, and our mission for existing is to convene the long-standing stakeholders in healthcare with the new industry incumbents. So we can call them entrepreneurs or startups or innovators. And so that's the purpose and the strategy of our convening space. There's a great opportunity if you want to get to know each other better or our community better. Next Monday, we've got one of our signature events, and it's called a Reverse Pitch Day. And what we do is we put large institutional enterprises, in this case, it's Regents Blue Shield, the insurer, University of Washington Medicine, and Multicare, up on stage and have them pitch out to an audience of entrepreneurs some of their pressing challenges in the healthcare industry with the intention of finding an entrepreneur to solve that problem for them and get to work on a pilot. So it's a really interesting twist on a lot of the sort of startup matchmaking models that are out there, and we welcome you to come back. But that is certainly not the focus of tonight. The focus of tonight is the kickoff of our signature Spring Forward with Women Leaders series. And we're thrilled to be the first place to start this important speaking series and topics. And so glad that you're all here joining us tonight. We have a number of partners, and so I have to read the list because they're important. I don't want to miss anybody. Partner organizations who really, basically everyone said yes when we came up with this topic and said, you know, do we want to create a series around this in partnership? And so those organizations are Ada Developers Academy, Artemis Connection, CoMotion, that's the University of Washington, Galvanize Seattle, the Washington State Department of Commerce, and the WTIA, the Tech Industry Association. And so all of them, all of us together have pulled off this event series that starts tonight and ends at the end of April. I also just want to give a shout out to our David Shepard here at Cambia Grove. He put together the entire curriculum series and programming that connected all of our organizations tonight. And so I just wanted to thank you for your dedication and humble work here, David, and recognize you as we kick off. So as you probably read about when you registered for this event and any of the other events in the series, our intention with Spring Forward with Women Leaders is growing out of our region, and we call ourselves Cascadia, not just Seattle or not just the Puget Sound. So Cascadia's collective commitment to do better on topics like gender pay equity, gender diversity, inclusion, and leadership in the fields of STEM, tech, healthcare, entrepreneurship, and investing. So kind of mashing all of those fields together, and I think we've got a broad cross-section of women in those leadership areas tonight. And if you haven't already heard about the entire series, on the Cambia Grove community section of our website, you can go read about the rest of the events, find out how to get involved, and join the series at the other locations around town between now and the end of April. Couple more things to highlight here. So all of these events, they are free and they are open to the public. And the keynote event that we're hosting has Washington Representative Tana Sen on an important topic coming up. And so that wasn't able to be done without some key and important sponsors as well. And so to acknowledge our series sponsors, we've got the Women's Funding Alliance and 100% Talent, both of which are here tonight. And Lisa Harrison is going to come give a couple of remarks about her organization. And with gratitude, we thank her for joining us tonight and for sponsorship. Lisa.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I've had the pleasure of speaking to a few of you tonight. I am the director of 100% Talent, which is actually a joint project with Women's Funding Alliance and the Chamber where I actually am at. And this started back in 2013 when there was discussions about what's going on in our area about the gender wage gap. And Women's Funding Alliance digged in and did some of the data, and we looked at it and we were shocked at how we were actually performing, and it didn't really line up with the values that we have here in the region. And that was that women in King County are making 76 cents for every dollar that a man makes. And if King County was actually a state, we would place about 41st. So it was a little shocking to see those numbers. And so the two organizations teamed up, and we've launched this initiative called 100% Talent. And the framework for that, and there's some booklets over there, I brought plenty for everybody to take away, is within these 4 categories of think, act, share, and invest. So we're asking companies to look at their gender wage gap, and we're providing a toolkit for them to be able to do that. And with that framework, they can then act, and we're asking everybody to take, excuse me, take 3 best practices, and they're outlined in here. I don't want to break it down for everybody, but it's in there. And we're asking them to take on 3 best practices and apply those to their company. What's really nice too about what we did was we looked at how we could have these be within the 4 walls of a company, but also what could be done in the community as well. Because this is really an issue that is impacting not just the individual, but the health of our community. And then we share those best practices. There's going to be events and opportunities and summits for those participating signatories to share best practices. It's a learning cohort, essentially. And then the final step is we're asking every company to make an investment. This is a 5-year initiative, and we feel like everyone is a little more committed when they've got a little bit of, as they say, skin in the game, and it will help us drive the program forward. So that gives you a little snapshot about 100% Talent, and you're going to have a wonderful panel tonight that's really going to dig into this topic a little bit more. So thank you so much for the opportunity to tell you about it.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We're so grateful for your support of this, and we look forward to learning more and getting engaged with 100% Talent. And so now on to the panel. So I'm here to introduce Liz Vivian. She's our moderator for the evening, and she is, let's see, I want to make sure I've got this right. She's with the Women's Funding Alliance, our second partner. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Liz and let you start the panel. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. I'm going to hand this down to share that over there. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for a very warm welcome. I want to make sure this is in the right place. Is that okay? Great, thank you. So again, I lead Women's Funding Alliance. Our mission is to advance leadership and economic opportunity for women and girls in Washington State. So we do a lot of work around highlighting where the gaps are, coming forward with best practice solutions, and then investing in all of those solutions so that years later we start to see all of the outcomes that we want to see for all women in Washington State. We are really excited to be partnering around this initiative. We do a lot of community engagement and community outreach activities ourselves, and the opportunity to partner and sort of spread even further through the community with Cambia Grove and with great panelists that are with us today is a really exciting opportunity. So we're thrilled to be here. And I'll take just a moment to add some additional framing to what you've already heard, and then we'll launch into a wonderful panel discussion. After that, we'll be open to audience questions. So I would love for all of you to be thinking about what questions do you want to ask the panel. So what we know is that statewide, so Lisa said, women in King County are earning 76 on the dollar for dollars earned by men. And as we talk about the gender wage gap, I think it's important for all of us to remember that we calculate that based on full-time year-round work, because that's what helps us compare apples to apples to apples every year and geographically around the country. It is a big macro number. It isn't literally saying 2 people are making different incomes, though that is oftentimes the case. A big piece of the gender wage gap is explainable, and so much of it is unexplainable, and it's really motherhood penalty or discrimination. What we have also learned is that there are really significant gaps among women. So what we know is that in our region and in Washington State, the lowest paid women are making 60 cents on the dollar to the highest paid women. That's a much larger wage gap than comparing all women to all men. What we also know is that women who have a high school diploma only are making 60 cents on the dollar to women with a BA. So if we think about educational attainment as a corollary with class, we can look at these gaps among women around race and ethnicity and class and see that they are so stark and that we have really significant work to do to close gaps among women in our community. We also know that the motherhood penalty can be really severe, or the corollary fatherhood boost around pay can be significant. And what we know is that in King County, moms are earning 67 cents on the dollar to every dollar earned by fathers, and that's mothers and fathers of school-age children who are working full-time year-round. So it isn't because more moms work part-time. This is for moms who are working full-time year-round. We also know that women serving in leadership positions has a significant impact around both employer practices and on larger public policy. However, only 12% of corporate board seats in Washington are held by women. So we can see how gender inequity plays out in different places. We know, because I know this audience knows this, that Washington State has the highest concentration of STEM jobs in the country, but that women hold only 1 out of 4 of those jobs. So we look to the pipeline around those issues, and what we know is that in Washington State, 1/3 of young women are taking pre-calculus compared to only 1/4 of young men. But by the time they get to their first year in college, more than twice as many young men are pursuing a career or a major in a STEM field. So we know that there are moments in a woman's life where she's making a choice to keep raising her hand and to keep standing up as a leader when she's in elementary school. We know she's making a choice in that transition from high school to college about what the major is. And we know there's another big transition as women are leaving college and deciding where are they actually going to work their field. And then 4 or 5 years later, are they actually going to stay at that company and stay in that field? And so as we think about solutions, there are moments in time where we might pull the lever and make a bigger difference than other times. And one of the things we found is that there are great programmatic solutions to this work. Activities like this, or even really specific negotiation trainings, or trainings for managers on how to better negotiate more fairly with their employees, or how to take gender bias out of that from the employer perspective. And we know there are public policy solutions that would make a huge difference. Paid family leave is one of the best levers that we could possibly pull to bring more gender equity to the workplace and narrow the gender wage gap. But in between those individual programmatic solutions and large-scale public policy changes that have been slow in coming, there is a huge world of employer practices and policies. And that's the piece of work that we really want to focus on learning more about tonight, is what are the solutions that we could bring to that space in particular, where we might have an immediate impact. Some of those best practices are immediately actionable, and they really could be put in place right away. You'll hear some of those stories from our panelists. Maybe some of you want to share those stories as you ask questions. But a lot of them take more time and more money and more collaboration. And if this was a really simple issue, we would have fixed it already, right? It's really complex, and the solutions are interesting and nuanced and can be tailored to the work that you do or the company that you lead. And so that's why I'm so excited about 100% talent, because I think it really brings the solutions to that employer middle, and it asks employer to start to step up as a leader around this issue to say, oh, we understand gender inequity is an issue, and there are actually solutions we could put in place. So it's really exciting to think about where we could go from there. So with all of that to frame some data and some thoughts about framing this conversation tonight, I want to ask each of our guests up here on the panel, Christy and Rebecca and Corey, to take a couple of moments to just introduce themselves, their name, the companies, the organizations that they lead, and to talk a little bit about their engagement around gender equity, particularly gender equity in the workplace. So we'll just go down. We'll start with Christy first.
Did I get it on?
There you
Okay,
go.
it's been a long day. Hi, Christy Johnson. I'm the founder and CEO of Artemis Connection. Artemis is the goddess of midwifery and hunting, so that represents a lot of my workforce who are women who actually want to work but haven't been able to find something that let them also caregive, whether it be for aging parents or for children. So what we are, we're a blend of management consulting, so top three, a lot of us are ex-McKinsey, Bain, or BCG, and then human-centered design thinking. And we work with organizations of all size on long-term scalable solutions. We're all about impact. So big corporate 500 companies, Fortune 500 companies, some of those folks, rapidly growing startups, and then we have some private equity and VC companies that we work with on a regular basis. So that's a little bit about me. I have a 6-year-old and I have 22-year-olds, so life is a little insane.
Thank you. Rebecca?
I just got tired of hearing that. I'm Rebecca Pomerang. I'm the CEO of Moss Adams Wealth Advisors. Moss Adams is a public accounting firm that's headquartered here in Seattle. I'm on the firm's executive committee and our operations management committee, and I was one of the founding advisory board members of Forum W, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but that's Moss Adams' initiative to hire more women, develop more women leaders in the accounting profession and within our firm. So that's kind of my connection to this topic. I'm also actually on the board of the chamber and on the board of Women's Funding Alliance, and Moss Adams was one of the early companies to sign on to 100% talent. So we're super committed to this issue, not just me, but as an organization, we're really committed to gender equality across the board in our organization.
Thank you. Corey?
Hi, I'm Corey Gaborlis, and I'm the founder of the Essential Group, which is a company that focuses on leadership, innovation, and executive coaching. I come to this work out of my own 18-year career in the legal and technology sectors. I've had a number of roles, including being outside counsel and then inside counsel to technology companies, and then coming into Microsoft Corporation and holding different leadership positions, managing engineering teams, operations teams, and business teams. So today, my focus is really on helping people, most of my clients tend to be women, helping them find a place of fulfillment in the workplace instead of the struggle that I often experienced on my own. And I base that work on my own experiences over this career, learning what works and what doesn't work so well. I think that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you. All right, let's dive in. Christy, question. How would you characterize the urgency around this issue for our region?
Sure. So in terms of urgency, I mean, I think it's a top talent issue, especially if you look at what's going on with the unemployment rate. And then specifically, I was sharing with Liz earlier, like I travel a lot. So we actually have big companies more willing to engage us in other regions than they are in the Seattle area. Sometimes I get really frustrated when I end up talking to executives here versus, Denver or Silicon Valley, which is where I'm going back to tomorrow morning, because there's more of a willingness to act down there. But if we want to be competitive, and if we say we're a tech industry that wants to be competitive, we absolutely must focus on it because there's incredible talent that's not fully utilized in this area, and it tends to be a lot of women.
Rebecca, do you agree?
I would say I think the competition for talent is fierce and urgent. So I feel urgency around that. So whether I look at this as it would be the right thing to do to pay women equally, like that's urgent to me, just basic kind of human rights and rightness. But then I also look at wanting Seattle to be globally competitive. We need to be able to retain talent to move here and to stay here because they see opportunity. And we need to be able to access the whole workforce and the deep talent in the workforce. And we can't do that if we're only accessing the people that we want to pay the most and kind of missing half the population with that. So I think that's urgent, whether it's just from a basic, we should do the right thing, or we want to be the best city in the country and we want to build the best businesses in the country, well, then we've got to be competitive. And that's urgent.
Christy, when you hear businesses talk about it, do they think about their own profitability? Is it sort of in that lens, or is it about civic duty?
Yeah,
Like,
this has been the grand experiment, right? And when we started out, we originally were very focused on women in the workplace, and we found that people would talk about it from a PR standpoint, but they didn't really want to pay anything for it. And so we've been playing with our positioning, but what does seem to really anchor people, the business outcomes that seem to matter. And female CEOs are a different breed, but there aren't that many CEOs, female CEOs in this region. So they're a little bit of a different breed on how they're thinking about things and role modeling. But for the other companies, if they can link it to customers, so when we're able to say, hey, your customer base is 75% female, and then I look at your leadership board, like, what's that about? And they're like, oh, good point, maybe we should. So there's some sense of urgency in that situation. And then the second sense of urgency is when you're able to point to some of that research that's come out of Catalyst and McKinsey and Credit Suisse about like companies that are more diverse with gender, 15% improvement in their ROI on their returns. And then if you add in gender and race, it's 35% improvement. That's when we'll get these very interesting conversations about like, why aren't we doing something about that? Now I have more questions. So at first it felt a little crass to be like going with that hardcore bottom line, but when I'm talking to these male executives, that seems to be the thing that gets their attention.
Please.
Quick about that. It has been very interesting to see the business case evolve within Moss Adams. So we had a gender initiative forever. We're 105 years old. We've probably had a gender initiative for like 103 years. But it started out as we won't blatantly discriminate and we won't sexually harass and we'll put in a flexibility schedule so you can work from home one day a week if you want to. And that was really kind of it. Then we started looking at, are we losing women that we want to keep? And how is that hampering our growth? That started raising people's attention. Then we lost 2 large prospect opportunities for exactly the reason you said. They sat down at a table, 2 organizations run by women, one a healthcare organization run by nuns, and another one a high-tech company run by women. And they sat down at a table full of male accountants and said, is this it? Like, is this, you're selling to a big prospect. Is this all you can put in front of me? And the men were like, well, what are you hoping to see? And they're like, I don't see anyone in this, not nuns. Obviously, we're not always going to employ nuns, but they said, we don't see any women. Tell us about the women. Oh, well, we have a woman that works in this industry group in, New Mexico. They're like, that's not, they wanted to see more representation. That started getting people's attention. The stories around, how about we just do this because we're good people, that people didn't understand it till we really emphasized the business case, the hard business case, and talked about profitability, competition for talent. And we could quantify, we hire more than 50% women every year. More than half the people we hire are women. We could quantify what we invested in those women up until the time that they left. And we could say, well, here are the dollars walking out the door in the talent base. That got people's attention.
Absolutely.
So, sorry, one thing to add. I find around talent, sometimes leaders don't have high enough expectations and they don't have their fingers on the numbers like they do in other parts, like their product development or those sorts of things. So there was one high-tech company in the region we were meeting with, and the executive was saying he has 200% annual turnover. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's really, tell me about that. Like, how does that work out? And he starts to explain what's going on. I was like, do you think that's costing you money? He's like, well, we've always thought it might be, but we haven't really quantified it and we can't prove it, so we haven't done anything about it. And it was almost like, I will put money on the table that we could get that down and like prove that that has an impact on your bottom line, but realized that the leader just wasn't thinking that way about talent. So it's very interesting.
Wow.
To be an accounting firm. We count stuff.
That's true. Corey, this is a really complicated topic, and a lot of organizations are addressing it, as leaders and talking to leaders, but your work is much more personal. And I'm wondering if you can talk about some examples of the ways you empower women and how you think that is ultimately leading to that larger change that we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I first want to say that I do not mean to imply by anything I'm about to say that women hold the keys to this entire problem in their hands, but I do think it's a piece of it. I think there's many things that go into helping this overall problem, and so one of the places that I start with my female clients is building self-awareness. And we look at building self-awareness around how much influence the particular woman actually might have to affect her outcomes. Often, that looks like helping bring her into more of her own agency and staying clear of a victim mentality, really staying clear of that. And what I mean by that is often it's easy to get wrapped up in thinking, what do they want me to do and what do they think of me? And that keeps you out of your agency. And so I have found that it can be a much more powerful place to come from if you can start to think, who am I? What is my value, and what do I want my future to contain? So that's a piece of this self-awareness that we start with, and from there we move into this idea of really asking ourselves honestly, am I showing up? Because that's another big piece of it. Am I showing up? And what I mean by that is asking ourselves, am I bringing my contributions to the table in a way that's visible and compelling? Can I articulate my value? And do I have a plan for articulating that value consistently? So these are things that often I find we aren't really told in our career. We think we just show up and we do the work and someone will notice. And a lot of that is understandable. A lot of that comes from sort of the legacy that we're coming out of, right? You know, we're socialized, many of us, to think that, you know, our job is to show up and be courteous and be deferential and be humble. And those are nice qualities, but in the workplace, they diminish power. And they don't necessarily set us up well to advocate for ourselves when it's time for promotion or a raise, or even if we're not advocating for ourselves, to be noticed and chosen. So I could talk about that all night, but I'll just stop with that.
Well, I have a follow-up question for you. I'm wondering, is part of that about women being more like men, or how do you equalize that power and think about how that plays out around bigger gender equity issues?
Yeah, I think what I would say, none of this is about women pretending to be men. I think women bring so many inherent or native talents to... Good to know. I think women bring so much to the table that you know, we really wouldn't want to lose. And that's when women are showing up as women, you know, so the ability to collaborate, to be open, to be transparent, to be more introspective potentially. So we don't want to lose that. What this is really, I would say, more about is understanding that we're coming into an era where we have access to the arenas of power. And we're coming out of an era where we really didn't. You know, this is in business, this is in government, this is in sports. And the thing is that period of time that we're coming out of has left a legacy, and that legacy has external barriers that we've been talking about, and it also has internal barriers, which is where most of my work comes from. And so the idea here isn't you have to do this or you should do this or it looks like being a man. It's let's just get really aware of what that legacy of inner barriers looks like in our own lives, and let's look at some of the tools that we can use to move out of it, and then you choose. So that's what I'll say to the pretending to be men piece.
Cool, thank you. Rebecca, your work at Moss Adams reflects a strong organizational commitment that you talked about a little bit, how that business case was evolving. And I'm wondering if you can give us some more examples of how Moss Adams thinks about success, given that this issue is really sticky and stubborn. Yeah. And as you think about your own programmatic initiatives, how are you thinking about incrementally moving forward?
You know, I think for us, it kind of had to start in getting to the question right away of success. We had to start with a lot of why questions about why is this happening. If any of you have ever raised a 3-year-old, you're familiar with the why. And sometimes you get to the end of that and you're like, well, that was actually really interesting. The last answer is really pretty interesting. So we looked at 2 things. We looked at, are women being paid less for doing the same work? For me, that's one set of problems. Or are women being paid less for doing different work? That's a different set of problems. So we really have had to put in place systems, and we would measure success differently for the 2 different areas. One being, if we have a man and a woman in the same role, doing the same work with the same performance, and he's being paid more than she is, that can't continue. It can't happen. The people who are perpetuating that would get fired. I mean, it's just not, it's not conceivable anymore, that it just can't happen because of the systems that we've put in place. So we've really been very careful to have performance-based pay, which means we have to be able to evaluate what someone's pay increase is going to be on some factor other than, well, does he look like me? Yep. Did he go to the same college as me? Yep, he's going to get a bigger raise than her, because I'm pretty sure she leaves at 4:30 every day to pick up her kids from school. So like, we have to have a system in place that can really say, this is what someone needs to do to perform well on this job. We're going to evaluate them objectively against these criteria. And then there's a very set compensation system in which they can grow based on fulfilling these criteria. It's almost a blind system, not just to gender, but to any other areas where we could discriminate, because we want to make sure that we're really rewarding for performance. Well, that means you have to have a really good system in place to understand performance, communicate about performance, coach on performance, and then pay on performance. So we've really used those sorts of systems to address the questions of men making more than women for doing the same work. But when we look at it in our organization, that's not usually the root of the problem. So if we ask the question, why do men on average make more money at Moss Adams? The first question would be, well, because they're in higher paying jobs. Well, why? Because women leave before they get to that level. Well, why? Because they don't think they have the skills to be successful as a partner, which is where you make the money. Well, why? Because we don't coach them and mentor them, and they don't have any role models. Well, why aren't we addressing that? I mean, we can get to the solutions by asking the why, and not stopping at the, well, they're paid less because they're in less high, because they don't stay for the high paying jobs. Well, that's just not acceptable. When we look at the workforce we need to have to be competitive in the client base that we want to serve, we can't have a bunch of 58-year-old white men serving our clients, because that doesn't reflect our client base. We have to have strong women serving our clients, leading our organization. We have 27% female partners in our firm, which is by far leading in our profession, but it's not enough. It's not even close to enough when we look at our client base and we look at the diverse talent base that we need. So when we look at our organization, and again, the answer to the why question differs so much by organization, but in our organization, it was really that question of, why are women leaving? And if we're recruiting more than 50% of our new people out of college every year are women, and 27% of our partners are women, and when we started 4MW, 18% of our partners were women. So at that time, we're looking at that and saying, what's happening in the middle and why are people leaving? So that's where we really focused our efforts, was on how do we help women stay through that part of their career where they're thinking, either I'm never going to be able to achieve the work-life balance that will be fulfilling to me across all aspects of my life, or what we found even more often was people saying, well, I'm never going to have the skills to make very much money here anyway, I might as well go do something else. And sometimes we still hear people use the work-life balance thing as a reason, when really what they're thinking is, I don't know how to develop business, and no one's ever going to teach me that. I don't get the opportunities to go along and see that happening like my male colleagues do, because I don't know how to talk about sports in the car ride on the way there. And the male partners think it would be inappropriate to take a young female professional on a 2-hour car ride to see a client. We have to stop that stuff, and we have to look at our women specifically and say, this woman's been a manager for 6 years. Why? All the men that came in her class advanced 2 years ago. Why didn't she advance? Were those because of decisions she made or decisions we made about the assignments that she would take? Is she consciously participating in this path, which takes a lot of customization? And I'm not saying every woman should make the decision to proceed on the same path or at the same pace, but they have to be an active participant in that conversation. So this is like the longest rambling answer to your question, but I will go back to that question of, is it women getting paid less for doing the same work or for doing different work? And if it's for doing different work, we have to get them doing the same level of work, create access to opportunity, because as the gender gap, is it an opportunity gap? And if it is, we can address that.
Absolutely.
I don't even know if I addressed your question, but
Well, it's super helpful, and I'm wondering how you look at evaluating progress and knowing that your new policies are working, or your investments in Forum W is worth it.
yeah, because we're accountants, there are some things we can really measure. We do have more female partners. We have we've decreased our turnover rate of women that are in that 3 to 6 year period in their career, which we think is the most critical one. We have more women in leadership training. We have more women getting outside coaching. So we can count that stuff. For me, as much as that is the anecdotal changes that I have seen. And I'm no longer the first person in every meeting to say, have we looked at that through a gender lens? Now the men in the executive committee are saying, gosh, in our slate of candidates for this important committee, why do we have more men than women on the slate? That's a change. It's not one I know how to weigh on a scale, but that's actually, I think, been the more monumental change, is the cultural change. When we started Forum W, we said, for the first 2 years, all we're going to be able to count is activity. We had 3 networking events, we had 6 brown bag lunches, and we just counted activity. But we said eventually what we want to see is cultural change. And the longer we commit to this initiative, the more we're going to move away from activity we can count to cultural impact that we can feel, but we can't put it in front of our accounting partners and say, this is why this was worth this money, because it adds up to these dollars, but they can see it. And we are getting better outcomes. And we know that there are some specific opportunities we've won now because of the women that we can put in front of clients.
Well, that's measurable. Christy, you work with a lot of different organizations and you consult around this topic. And I'm wondering, what are some mistakes that organizations make, or what values and practices do you help them adopt that moves them closer to the outcomes we want to see?
Sure, and this is so interesting. I think you hit right on it, Rebecca. A lot of times we'll see companies lift a program that's been successful elsewhere. So unconscious bias training, which Facebook and Google and Microsoft all have open source. So anybody can lift the content and what it is that they're doing. Has it moved their numbers? No. And they're actually moving away from it some, but we're seeing a lot of other companies are adopting that. So I think one is like knocking into the root cause of what is the issue for your company, where are things falling down, and thinking about that instead of just immediately putting in some sort of program. I think the second thing is being really clear on why this matters. And sometimes people get really like it's just the right thing to do, which is helpful, right? And that's motivating for some people. I think having multiple angles to go with this, and then where we see the best action is when it's tied to business outcomes. So we need to represent our customer base. We know that this will have a better impact on our bottom line, and that's something that we want to do to be competitive. So that's the second thing, is having a really clear, compelling reason for why that's communicated broadly. A third is on having some data. So I'm like a big, huge geek on this one, but having granular data, I mean, take your engagement survey, look at it, male, female, see if there are any nuances that are there. Know your pipeline and know your numbers. A lot of companies don't. And what I love is when I meet a CEO and he or she can tell me, like, I know my men versus my women in engineering versus non-engineering, by VP, by director. I know all the names of the folks that are VP and director and what it will take for them to make the next level. So like that emphasis and focus on the data and then the individuals behind that data is really important. Mm-hmm. And then I think the last one is taking some action. I'm thinking systematically, because we all have unconscious bias, right? Like I know I have it in certain situations. And so I put up systems, because I can't take the bias out of myself as much as I want to, but I can put up in a system that will help correct for that. So there's this really cool software platform called Unitive that's doing some things to systemize. It's a hiring platform for managers. So there are systems like that that you can put into place that will help. But we do find sometimes organizations will talk about it, and it's like they get so... I pick particularly if it's an all-male leadership team, like when the magnitude of what's happening hits them, or when they start to hear some of those stories about things that have happened, or they see the data that we pay people differently, sometimes they freeze a little bit. Mm-hmm. Like, just do something, like do a mini pilot somewhere and see what happens. At least you're gonna know if it worked or not. You don't have to spend a ton of money. So like my one client right now, I'm so proud of, they're the ones I'm going to go see tomorrow. They're VC, and the VCs that actually make money and have women doing the deals, it's only 3% of the women that are doing the deals. So we've been on these guys for a while, like you should hire a woman, you should hire a woman. They hired a woman, so like they're slightly helping that. And they're also going to have us working with their portfolio companies who've just received a round of funding to put systematic things in place very early on, because prevention is so much easier than rehabilitation. It's just like healthcare. To try to put some things in place so as they scale, they won't have as much gender inequality. They'll have some practices with pay that are best practices. So they're making a little bet. We're going to run an 18-month experiment. We'll look at the data monthly and see how it's playing out and check and adjust. But like taking some action and starting somewhere is really important, and not just freezing.
Absolutely. Corey, I have a question for you, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see mentoring and championing within companies as part of the solution.
Yeah, I think Rebecca alluded to it earlier with some of the things that aren't happening, where you see people doing either getting paid less for the same work or getting paid less for different work. So frequently there aren't mentors or champions who are like you in the companies. Most of my career I was the only woman in the room. And I've only worked for a woman once, actually. And I really felt that because the language that's used is different and the modeling is different. So I think it's a big piece of this. And I think we can't let it be an excuse that, well, there aren't senior women in our company, so too bad, so sad. I think it's, as Rebecca said, get the coaching one way or the other. If it has to be outside, get it. If the mentoring has to be outside, get it. Send the women to women dominant organizations and training and alliances, things like that, because it matters. I know for me in my own career, I didn't understand the feedback I was getting from my male managers. I really didn't get it. And I don't think they knew how to speak to me either. And I think they were afraid to give me feedback. And I think that that's a pretty common experience. And so one of the things that I have a lot of mid-career and senior women come to me asking about is, tell me what my blind spots are. I know I have them and I know they're holding me back, but no one will tell me what they are, or they're telling me, but I have no idea what they're talking about. And guess what? It's not rocket science. Some of the blind spots that keep women specifically back, that keep us playing small, are really common. It's just that we don't know what they are because we can't see ourselves. So I think that mentoring piece, get it wherever you have to get it, but it cannot be ignored. The other thing I'll say about mentoring that I know holds a lot of women up on getting the mentoring help is they think, I need to find that one perfect person. And that's one of those, I think, just kind of procrastinating things that keeps us back. You can have a mentor who's a mentor for public speaking, or a mentor who knows how to run meetings, or a mentor who knows how to network. It doesn't have to be this perfect person. So I would just kind of start to look around you and collect the people that can mentor you for the different things that you really want to be working on at that particular point in your life. Sponsorship, of course, is a different thing, and that's a lot harder to come by. That's really about finding someone who's got a seat at the table, who can be advocating for you in that room that you're not invited to be in, but you sure hope your name gets mentioned in. And that's something that takes a really long time to find, and it has to be someone within your company, within the division. So we are a little more limited in that way, I'll say.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, please.
This is both about sponsorship and about mistakes. So one of the things that we found was, if we relied on me to mentor and sponsor everyone, we weren't ever going to make enough progress. And if we relied just on our women to do it, we weren't going to make enough progress. So starting a couple of years ago, we have 265 partners in our firm, and every partner sets goals every year. We have a partner scorecard we do every year that looks at metrics like new business and how much revenue you manage and all those super important things. We said another thing you need to put on your scorecard is who is the high potential woman that you're sponsoring this year. All 265 people had to do it. So it couldn't just be that developing women was a women's issue, or that Rebecca will fix it on her enthusiasm alone. It had to be everyone in the organization has responsibility, and everyone in the organization has different levels of influence and different ability to sponsor because their own seat at the table is a little bit different. So we had people write down, who are you sponsoring? Then we went through and said, this high potential woman, this guy isn't powerful enough to sponsor her. We need to find her a more influential sponsor. And we did that throughout the organization to make sure that that was aligned, but it was really important to make it clear it wasn't just the steering committee's responsibility or the women's responsibility. Everybody had, like you said, do something. Everyone had to do something. And that turned out to be much more impactful in people understanding, just not being sexist isn't enough to advance women. You actually need to make a personal commitment to sponsor someone and take responsibility for moving someone along.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add just one thing to that too with the sponsorship? So McKinsey actually has a book out called Centered Leadership, which is fantastic with some tools and techniques on advancing women. They talk a lot about mentorship versus sponsorship. And I think when I was younger in my career, I assumed I needed to have female mentors and sponsors, but honestly, like some of my best mentors and sponsors have been men. So there's a really critical role to play, and I think for women being open to that as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Christy, this next question is for you. I was talking with a CEO of a local tech company who is a woman who said when she was asked in general about a gender wage gap, went to her HR department and they were like, ooh, yeah, maybe there are some things. And it turns out it was a lot in sales. And she was sort of curious. She was like, these women negotiate the heck out of deals for our company every single day. And the HR staff was like, but they don't negotiate on their own salary. And she's like, well, that's not acceptable. Let's fix this. And so I'm wondering how tech solutions that are about transparency, particularly Glassdoor and PayScale, are really changing women's power in those situations. And is this about access to information, or is it something more internal to women that we negotiate or advocate on others' behalf but not our own?
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm a huge geek, right? Like, who else would study math and econ? So I love data, I love research. There's a lot of research about this. I mean, there is something about access to information, right? Because it is hard.
Yep.
There are transparency tools. There's PayScale, there's Indeed, there's Glassdoor. Like, you can actually get quite a bit of information. And by the way, the millennials will all share their salary information all the time and think nothing of it. That's a whole nother story. So it is, some of it was access to information, but that's rapidly becoming less of a problem. There is something that sociologists and psychologists are looking at around willingness to ask, and that it's easier for a woman to ask for like her team or her company or her family, but it's harder for her to ask personally. And there also are examples of when that has backlashed against women, where they're labeled as being too aggressive for trying to negotiate. So it's a really tricky situation. I've actually found it with my business. Like, if I have guys on the team negotiate with clients, they can always get a higher deal than I will. So I'm like, okay, well, what's that about? So, I mean, it is a tricky thing, this whole negotiation. And I think it's complicated in a bunch of different areas. But I'm hopeful now that there are more transparency tools so women can equip themselves, and that they can maybe frame it as it's not just about me, it's about taking care of my family or other goals that I have, or obligation to other women who work at this company to negotiate for a higher salary.
I think to add to that, there's this huge piece for women that contributes to exactly this thing that you're talking about, which is I don't want to negotiate for myself or advocate for myself. And it's the inner critic, that nasty inner mean girl that all of us carry around. And I really think it's so important to be aware of it and to be aware of how it might be driving your behavior, and start to choose differently. You know, what channel am I going to tune into? Am I going to tune into that and let that drive my behavior, particularly in the context of asking for what I deserve, or am I going to tune into a different channel? So I'll just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, there's one more component then, Rebecca. Too, if you look at like what drives women in career choices, meaning tends to be higher for them than other elements. Compensation tends to be higher for men. So, I mean, I've done this myself too, right? Like, great job, you're going to pay me to do that? That's super cool. Like, I'm not going to negotiate as much because the job's so meaningful to me, and that's what I derive career satisfaction from. So that's, I think, another thing just to consider.
Kind of, my point was kind of similar to that. Corey mentioned earlier that women wait to be recognized. And I think this is both from research and just from personal experience in managing men and managing women. I see that men, not all men, there are a lot of men that this isn't true, but they see compensation more as a right. It reflects what they've earned, and women see it more as recognition, and they don't want to ask for recognition. They want recognition to be given to them. And I think it makes women and men negotiate differently. So just like we don't want to say, you know, we don't want to ask for the promotion, we don't want to ask for advancement, we want someone to recognize us. I think the same thing happens with compensation, because I actually think compensation means something different to women than it means to men, and it makes us behave not always in our best interest.
Well, we are going to open this up to audience Q&A. David, is there a roving microphone, or how do you want us to do that in this space? Do you think we need it? What do you want to do? Yeah, absolutely.
Here, it's roving.
Yeah. So now we have time for some audience questions to the panel.
So I have been a tech recruiter in Seattle since the early 2000s, and I've worked for large companies, I've worked for small companies, I've worked for agencies. Right now I'm working for a division of Comcast, a technical division, and it has been my experience in Seattle that I have never seen a practice where women are offered less money than men because they're women. What I have seen is that women negotiate less than men. The caveat to that is when they do negotiate, they negotiate harder. So I would like to know, kind of more anecdotally, maybe specifically from you and you, how you encourage women to continue that throughout their career. Because I'm in the HR group, but I'm seeing across the board, the longer you get into one job, the more your growth slows down from a base perspective, but you can get higher. Yeah, anyway, so I'd like to know how you would encourage women, especially older women, because I think that the millennials, it's been my experience, they're much more willing to go to bat for themselves. But for women maybe in their 40s and 50s who are realizing that maybe they are making less money or they're starting to become part of this conversation, how would you counsel them, and what things would you tell a woman to change the way she's been working for the last 25 years?
And I'll pass the mic down. I just want to say one thing on the flip side. I've seen companies realize this difference as well. So Quora, they're a Q&A tech company out of the Valley, very well funded, ex-Facebook guys. And then Teach for America, actually, they know that this happens, and so they just have a strict no negotiation policy, and they don't do it for men or women. The offer is the offer. They have a standard way of giving it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great point, and it's true. Women don't negotiate, and one of the problems that can really happen in a lot of companies is if you want to stay at that company, once you've already accepted that lower salary, you're pegged there, and actually the company, to follow their HR rules, can only take you up by a certain percentage each year. So if you've gotten yourself into that situation, unfortunately, it might be leaving or finding a way to get someone to champion one of these data-driven efforts like Salesforce is doing right now, which is resulting into a tremendous amount of women getting raises because they're looking at the data, and their CEO is relentlessly pursuing that. So that's a problem that we can find ourselves in if we didn't know to negotiate in the first place. As far as helping women get ready to negotiate, some things that I'll say that I think we could do a better job of is preparing. One is knowing your value. Know what you're worth, know how it affects the bottom line that you're going to be working toward, and also know what it is that makes you so good at doing what you do. The second is the research, which we've been talking about how the data is more readily available, but it's really important to know in your particular market what is paid for similar work and for similar experience. So many women I know go into this conversation blind. So do the research. Some other just negotiation things that I think about that would be helpful in this conversation. One includes being creative. This might not get you to that base salary number that you want to get to, but the thing I'll say is if you are so fixated on a base salary number, you might miss some other things that are high value to you but low value to the employer. So for example, some employers really don't have any flexibility on the base pay, particularly if you're in the situation we talked about a minute ago. But maybe they have more flexibility on something you value, like advancement velocity or time off or bonus. So those are interesting things that you can explore if you're not too fixed on that base. Other things that come to mind as we're talking are, it's also, I think, a really strong suit to go in with a range rather than a number, because it gives the impression that you're reasonable, and it also lets them have a win. Just make sure the bottom of the range is a range you'd be happy with. Yeah, so that's a great one. And then, other things that I think really help are the internal piece that I've been talking a little bit about. One is when you're getting ready to go into the negotiation, I think it's incredibly valuable to prime yourself for power. So some of that can just be bringing an experience to mind that is from your own life when you felt powerful, when you felt confident, that when you really nailed it, when you drove an outcome that was really important to you. Another piece is the work that Amy Cuddy does, of course, on power posing. She's coming to town next week. She'll be at Town Hall. That'll be a fun thing for people to see potentially. But I'll say this too. I don't believe you can prime yourself for power by doing it right when you're going into that negotiation. I think it needs to become a practice. And so one thing I personally do is I have my own I am awesome list. And I collect everything, kudos, achievements, deliverables that I can claim as my own. And I think it's a great idea to review that kind of thing regularly. So it's scrolling through your head rather than that negative spiral, the inner critic. And the final thing I'll say on this is, hey, let's not get ready for the raise conversation when we want the raise. Like the campaign needs to start from day one. So hit the ground running, because that's you want to be showing up the way you want to show up, well before it's time to get the raise.
I would just add one quick thing. I've actually never been in a position where I'm coaching people in my organization to negotiate their pay. That'd be super awkward. But I have two sisters that are in their 20s, and I find myself frequently coaching them on that. And I think the whole point about preparing, not taking it personally, and assuming that the person you're talking to is not taking it personally, to remove some of the emotion from the situation. And I also think to ask questions, like to say, gosh, if that's the high end of the range, what do I need to demonstrate over what period of time, to make it clear that you're not, even if there's no more room, this is not the end of the conversation. And to say, I'd like to revisit this in 3 months, or I'd like to go home and give this some thought before we settle this. It changes the mood in the room if they realize, oh, this conversation is not over, or in a year when we do her next raise, we better come prepared because she's not somebody that's going to roll over. So I think that preparation, and also the kind of open end to the end of the negotiation, particularly around the, okay, then what would it take? Those are the negotiations that I really respect when I'm having them internally. If someone says, okay, if that's really the top of the range, or that's all that you think is appropriate, because I don't negotiate very much on pay. I like it when they say, okay, how can I gain the skills? What do you need to see from me in terms of skills so that I would be worth more to you? And over what period of time, what kind of coaching can I do to get there more quickly? I love those conversations. So having had those conversations, I can now train my sisters on how to do that and not be so agonized, and not to take it personally like I did every time I had that conversation when I was in my 20s and early 30s. And how many times I went back to my office and cried about my compensation. I could kick myself now.
I love that point. Thank you for bringing that up. The point that I particularly love is that even if the conversation doesn't immediately result in the outcome you want, how can that conversation be a relationship building conversation? How can that conversation be a learning conversation? Same thing applies to feedback and reviews. That's another area that I really think that we can miss out on, just showing up as rock stars and growing from and building the relationships that we need to become our sponsors or our mentors, or the people that want to give us more money.
Well, and I think, Rebecca, not everybody loves to be on the other side of that negotiating table the way you might thrive as a boss and a manager and a leader in your organization. And I wonder about what kinds of training we need as employers to negotiate fairly, because I think about this as well. If we're all experiencing this, it's not each of our fault, right? There's a system at play here that is biased. And so understanding all of that and the individual dynamic around it is important. Yeah. And I wonder how we start to train managers and reset up our workplaces that we're ready for those kinds of conversations. Because I think oftentimes managers avoid the conversation about performance, just want to get through it, don't really know how to manage a workforce that is going to leave every day at 4 o'clock to go home and be present with kids and sign back on at 9 o'clock at night, or sort of figure out a more flexible approach, or have leaders who want to work 30 hours a week but still have a valued positional leadership role in the company. And I think employers haven't quite figured out how to nail that. And so we put all of it on training women to negotiate better, which is important. And I think all of that we could do better. And there's always a person on the other side who's not you.
Yeah,
right?
It's the nice thing about having structure in your compensation system, because I actually don't like those conversations, and I always worry, are their expectations going to be aligned with what I'm about to say? I hate those conversations. And I like that I have a structure where I can't say, okay, I'll give you another 5,000. That's just, then I would, then I'd have to explain to someone why I'm giving someone that raise without giving them a promotion. I'm really not right. I mean, I like the rigidity to some extent of our structure, because it prompts the next conversation, which is the more important one, around how can you develop more quickly. And if you want more pay, you need to have more responsibility, you need to have more performance. Let's focus on that piece, because that's the more important part of our coaching conversation than the dollar negotiation.
Next question.
So I think I'm probably old enough that I played the game, construction engineering, biomedical engineering. I was a firefighter. I run huge teams. We started mentorship programs in tech 10 years ago, and I kind of thought we were over this. Like I really did. And then I moved into the startup space, and I mentor startups, and they're smaller. They don't have HR departments. They're, 10 guys, and the cultural differences are profound. And so in the last 2 years, I had a startup, I was a director, and they had a 50 Shades of Grey team building exercise here in Seattle, so that was interesting. And then comments from the CEO of Microsoft that women should wait. And then I was just at a conference with 45,000 people for a Health Information Management System Society last week. And in meetings, the guys would only talk to the guys. And so it had nothing to do with negotiating, and it had everything to do with culture, and especially the international component. We're much more diverse now. And so how do you deal with that?
That's why I love my job. You can tell so much just by walking around the company and looking at the symbols on the wall and the ways that they celebrate and all of these things. I think what's interesting, so directly to your question, you're asking about like the culture and what do you do about that? Is that what you...
So the real world example, so we're going to have a 3-day retreat. It's a 50 Shades of Grey theme. Do you speak up, or are you one of the boys? Or you're at a table with 10 people, 3 other directors of large healthcare systems, and I can hold my own, but I can watch them exclude the women. Like their body language is, the 2 guys were jockeying for power and position. And so it was like, I was just aghast. But I couldn't figure out what to say or what to do. And I'm not a kid. And so I watched the young women, the millennials, actually just stop talking. And so they just gave up. And I thought, well, am I supposed to step in? Am I supposed to mom it? Like, okay, guys. Or should I specifically talk to the women? My niece, who's a millennial, said, oh, it's not bifurcated. There's no such thing as men and women. Why are you so old school? And I'm like, oh, okay. But I see it happening still. And so I'm just like, what do you do in the moment?
Well, I think in the moment is one situation, and it depends on the company and the culture, right? I mean, I've had some crazy things said to me, and in some situations I've called it out in that situation, and other times I'm like, there's absolutely no point to saying this, and then they're going to think I'm an emotional female or whatever it is that they're going to think. So what's the point, and like, what's my intent by having this conversation? If there's younger women in the room, I will always go up to them afterwards and be like, let's unpack what just happened. They're like, what did you feel? What did you experience? And have a conversation there. I think that's actually really important. And I think there's this broader issue with culture that drives me nuts sometimes, because there are some like fantastic companies with amazing leaders who are so committed to the like gender diversity and race diversity, and they will put dollars behind it and systems behind it, and like they're up to speed. And then there's like these crazy other cultures that get romanticized, right, because they're part of that startup world. So I wish there was like some sort of more transparency on culture, or a way to assess what was going on, and more of these stories were shared in a way that wouldn't have backlash. So there's the elephant in the room piece that came out about Silicon Valley maybe 6-ish weeks ago. But there needs to be something broader to help surface these stories so people can move and change. So Jeffrey Pfeffer, who's written a lot on power, he's a Stanford professor. He talks a lot about culture and leadership, and that organizations will never care about their people. And he's like, why don't people move? Like, people need to move. If it's a bad culture and these things are happening on a regular basis, go find another place to work, right? And at the end of the day, the good cultures are going to win. So.
I almost always say something. I didn't when I was younger, but I feel obligated to now that I'm an old person in my firm. I can't stand it anymore. It helps. I'm from the Midwest. I just naturally swear like a trucker, so I fit in that way. But I call people out very directly on. I won't use any of the language now because you're a very nice crowd. But I will say you're being a complete whatever. That's not the direction this conversation should go. And I'll say, I notice that you're turning your back towards all the women at the table. Like, I'm completely unpleasant, but I just, especially if there are other young women, which there usually are, and somebody has to set an example for them. And I probably do stick my foot in it more often than I should, but I also see the men in our organization getting more sensitive to it. And And we might have had a 50 Shades of Grey party if that book had been written 20 years ago, but we wouldn't now. And so it's not just me anymore. But there were years where there were only a few of us and we would say it every time. How come there's not a woman on that committee? How come you're having that conversation? Why are you telling lewd jokes that's super offensive? I also have a kind of obnoxious sense of humor. So I don't want to be the prude just for the sake of being the prude, but I think we have a responsibility to be professional. And sometimes I might just say, gosh, that's not super professional. More often I'll say, you're being a D-bag. It's one of my favorites.
I totally agree with that. I just will have to share one of my secret tricks in tech companies. Don't know if it will work with yours, but the whiteboard rules. So if you have conferences, if these meetings are happening in a room with a whiteboard, trust me, this works. Stand up, grab the pen, walk over to the whiteboard. You don't have to write a thing. Everybody stops and looks at you. You have the floor. It works every time.
Similarly, I encourage my young women, if we're in a big meeting and there are tables, I will tell young women I'll help them prepare, and I'll say, don't take the notes at the table. You don't want to be the secretary, but you do want to be the spokesperson. So when everyone's saying, who's going to be the spokesperson, put your hand up. Don't wait till someone says, oh, she had the nicest handwriting. Say, I want to be, assert yourself in that way. Because I think even the way we position ourselves in meetings can be really helpful or detrimental to the way that people see us. And it was in Sheryl Sandberg's book, but the comment about if you walk into a room and there aren't any chairs around the table, pull the chair up to the table and say, excuse me, and squeeze a chair in. Don't sit in the back row of the room, even if it looks like the polite thing to do. That it can take years to overcome how you position yourself inappropriately in a meeting one time. No pressure.
Yeah, and just to build on that, when you get your seat at the table, take up space. Put your stuff on the table, spread out. I see so many women kind of sitting like this with the notebook on their lap and taking notes. Again, polite, I don't want to take up space, but you're there to contribute what you have to contribute. So take up all the space you want and then some.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience.
Hi. So I am an MBA student at UW Foster, and throughout the course of 3 years, I've been in several student groups for school project or other stuff. And one thing that I always see whenever there is like men and women in a group, and then we have to designate it, who will be the project manager of this group, meaning someone who assign meeting agenda, someone who take care of external communications, things like that. Women tend to be the first person to volunteer for that, and come to think of it, might have something to do with being a thinker versus being a doer. And for some reason, women has this tendency to refill their presence as being a doer instead of a thinker. I don't know if this is common in your professional space, and I would like to get a comment on that, like how to position ourselves even in early career. Like, don't easily volunteer for a doer task, but more for a thinker task.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate that you're bringing that up. I think it's a complicated question, and one thing I will say that I see women do quite frequently is hide in that role. I call it curating. So you can get stuck in spending all of your time and your mental energy gathering all of the great ideas of everyone else, bringing them together in a beautiful project, formatting them, and you become known as the curator instead of becoming known for contributing your own great thoughts. Sometimes that can be, what you want to do, and that can be what you're really skilled at, and so that's great. There's no should not do that in this, but if that isn't where you want to be contributing your talents, and you keep getting those roles, particularly in a team or a common group, I think it's very acceptable to say, I did this last time, I think we should share this burden as a group. If it's the same group every time that's assigning you for that. I think this is one of those times too that's very appropriate to hide. When it's a meeting where someone's going to be assigned, that might be a good time to not be the one to stick your hand up and be really visible. But
or to volunteer someone else for the role. So to say, oh, John, you'd be great in that role. I always volunteer to run things because I get tired of waiting for other people to volunteer. Then I get halfway through and think, those people were smart. I'm doing all the work. Like, yeah, I'm curating their 2 ideas. I'm making them better. And somehow I look like the project manager. So I started saying, I always get the opportunity to be the project leader. I'm not going to wait for one of you to speak, but how about you be the project leader this time, and get somebody else to step up? Because I always fell and fall into that trap every time of speaking up first and then finding myself doing all the work.
Yeah, I agree. Although I do think there are times when it's okay to be the doer and not the thinker if it gives you access to somebody who has power, because that can be one of my favorite bosses of all time. So stressed. He was so stressed, and he just needed a pair of hands, and I knew that. And you'll read some books that say, like, don't let yourself get into that role. But it let us build a relationship, and then I was able to do some of the doing and then keep pushing the strategic thinking, the decision making, offering to help with more things. And it ended up being a fantastic relationship, and he's still like one of my best advocates and sponsors. So I mean, just kind of always be assessing each situation and thinking about what it is that you want and you need and what you want to learn if it's going to help fill that need.
So as we close the evening, I want to give each of you a chance to add something that you haven't had a chance to add, some final words of wisdom or final reflections about our conversation this evening. And we'll start with Corey, and then we'll come back down this way.
Oh, let's see. Well, I guess the final reflection is, what do they always say? You're the only one who can be you. So really, at the end of the day, my personal perspective about this is figure out, and it ties in a little bit with what Christy was just saying, but figure out what you value, what game it is you're playing. I always tend to think that there are 2 games you're playing. You're playing the game that you were, you're playing the hand, I guess, that you were dealt. And then there's this other thing that's going on over here, right? So what are you getting value out of that lends itself into your own personal agenda that your employer might not know about? And always keep your eye on that. Make sure that whatever you're doing, if you're being asked to do a task like this, it feeds into something that's of value to you. Because that's what brings the most fulfillment at the end of the day. And if you aren't getting fulfilled, either because you aren't being paid what you think you deserve, or something else is going on, yeah, that's time to move on. That's what I say.
I think what really brought me around to this whole topic was when I realized it wasn't about me, which was shocking, a shocking revelation that the world didn't revolve around me. But I think when you start looking at these issues for other women, and you look for opportunities to advocate for other women, and you think about your responsibility for other women, it doesn't even matter where you are in your career. There's someone who could benefit from your insight and your experience. And that's really what got me excited about this topic, because I wasn't discriminated against at work, and I make more than most of the men that I work with. And so I could look at that and say, well, this wasn't an issue for me. So good luck to all of you for whom that was an issue. And I did think that I didn't think that, but I thought, God, is it really an issue? That was not my experience. Well, just because it wasn't my experience doesn't mean it's not the experience for a lot of people. So saying, okay, it's not about solving something for myself. It's about solving something for my business, my colleagues, my sisters, my community. That gets really exciting. And then you can say, all right, if I didn't have a bad experience, how can I replicate my good experience for other people? If I did have a bad experience, how can I solve that for other people? That may be because I'm someone that sits around and wants to be recognized and doesn't want to focus on myself, but that really got me much more excited when I realized this wasn't about a battle for me and my rights and my progression and my pay. This was a battle for other people that in the end was also going to benefit my business. That got me much more excited than when I just thought it was about being able to negotiate for myself.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to like what you philosophically believe. And if you're in a role of power in your organization, which I mean, everybody has some sort of power, it's thinking about like, do you believe people are fundamentally a strategic asset, right? Like that's one thing. And then 2, do you believe people have unique gifts and strengths, and how can you access those through work, which we spend a third of our life at work, and what that looks like. And I mean, the thing that drives me nuts is there's they say there's 47 million additional FTEs in the world that could be in the workforce, which is like $1.37 trillion worth of worldwide GDP, and it's people who are either underemployed or unemployed. And mind you, I was not looking to start a company when I did. I had a 4-year-old, I had twins that were 7 weeks premature and had a bunch of healthcare needs. But I started finding other women, other moms who wanted to be working. And these are women who have engineering degrees. And they're like, I'll work for you for $10 an hour. I'm like, that's not minimum wage, like that's illegal. But there's this untapped potential of women who are awesome, and there's evidence that they're very productive, that want to be engaged and working. And if you fundamentally believe that, then there's all sorts of opportunity for you and your company and you as a leader.
Thank you so much, Christy and Rebecca and Corey. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you too, Liz. This is wonderful tonight. I'm just really inspired by a lot of the practical tips that we learned that we can take home in terms of helping others and taking some of these things back to our work. Thank you to those who are on the live stream as well for being with us tonight. And we will be, yes, we're on a live stream. And so we will be here for a little bit longer to continue our networking and engaging in conversation. And thank you once again.